Lapis and most of his variants have been some of my favorite cards in this game. One of the first deck lists I ever wrote was a big OTK TMS deck. A list now lost to the abyss of time because no one archives things. My first archetype video was on Apostles, Lapis's associated archetype at the time, and while I really didn't play his second incarnation, I found the concept of stealing your opponent's cards to be a rather interesting, if not horribly inconsistent idea. Honestly, my biggest force of will related regret is not taking a black-green Mikage that used Vampire Lapis as a win con to GP Tokyo back in 2018. Considering I didn't get my only loss until the very final round, I would have had a much easier climb with him, and potentially clapped out my last opponent and topped. Cause 5-1 isn't good enough to top in Japan. I guess what I'm saying is that if I had to be categorized into character attachment, this J-pop looking motherfucker would probably be my character. I was kind of hoping AO4 Lapis would be a nice retrain or reworking of at least one of his many gimmicks, since just about every other ruler in the set was given that treatment, but instead we got Limit Break, an awkward, overpowered switch-style mechanic. What does Limit Break do? Absolutely nothing. On its own, having a Limit Break of a card does nothing. Certain cards gain advantages when you have a Limit Break of them or their related cards, though. It's a lot like Dragon Emblems, which are also problematic in a similar way. The only difference is getting Dragon Emblems was tied to a mid-game playmaker, while Limit Break is actually printed on the ruler, which, giving credit where it's due, is exactly how a mechanic like this should work in Force of Will. My biggest problem with Limit Break is that there's zero interaction with them. You simply make a card stronger. Forever. And these buffs aren't minor things either. Most of Lapis's shown support with Limit Break gets exceptionally stronger, and even Lapis himself can become a 2020 J-Ruler should you name him. I should also note that his J-Ruler is essentially a useless piece of cardboard without his Limit Break, since the official ruling is that all text under Limit Break doesn't exist without owning a Limit Break of said card or whatever card triggers it. You never have to spend Limit Breaks though, you just kinda sit on them. And since they're items, your opponent can't interact with them either unless some kind of Limit Break removal card is made, which I highly doubt will ever happen. There's no real way for an opponent to stop or remove a Limit Break outside of killing off or canceling the cards that are boosted. Thankfully, no card gains barrier through Limit Break. There's no risk in it for Lapis, he can just freely rush whatever limits he wants and never have to worry about them being removed. These types of triggers, which I like to call a switch, need to consider the speed of the game and the reliability of reaching said boost when they're created. This is why having a 1-cost 12/12 is a horrible idea when it's possible to put 2 of them out on the second turn. In the past, switch-style mechanics were often tied to countable resources, things like the total number of magic stones or revealed runes, something that is either reliable in almost every game, or something that forces you to use up your resources to rush stronger effects. The problem is that most of these cards often lacked power until their switch was hit, meaning you're left with a suboptimal play that maybe becomes better later. This is why decks like Diversity Brunhild and Kaguya Cancel decks favor cheaper runes that have little or no cost to quickly boost up their resonators. And that's probably also why a bunch of seal cards never saw play. While I don't think most of the Limit Break resonators are designed to be as initially weak as some of these seal or rune cards, I think the way their skills work follow a similar trend. Most of said Limit Break cards are either standard or substandard. They're not unplayable, but a 4/4 precision isn't going to get you as much mileage as a lot of other turn 1 plays. However, a cost 1 12/12 that burns for its own attack when banished by an effect through either player is one of the dumbest forms of value I've ever seen. Lapis isn't good because his mechanic is well designed, he's good because his cards go from passable to bonkers without a step in between them. I think there are plenty of more ways to make Lapis's Limit Break ability more interesting, like, instead of just naming a card, have Lapis search his deck and attach a card to himself, similar to Ciel's Ore gimmick. The cards are still treated as items, so it limits opponent interaction, but it also creates a tangible thing to measure what Lapis has. It also sets up other potential interactions, since it pulls resources from the deck instead of just writing them down on a piece of paper. If there were ways for Lapis to spend his attached cards, then it turns him into a potential toolbox, which seems to be his other gimmick given how much minion searching he has. In simple terms, Lapis banishes a minion attached to him, revives it with one of the several revival cards in the meta, and now you have a revival-based toolbox that can easily search out key one-ofs. As for Lapis's own limit break, just make it based on how many cards are attached to him, make it like a threshold of 3 or something. Also, if you make it a threshold like that, then it also incentivizes him to not remove cards from him because he would then lose his limit break. This kind of mechanic would also let you alter what things his J-Ruler side can do. When he enters the field, he could search for 2 minion resonators, attaching one to himself and putting the other into the field. Instead of his God's Art being a generic field neg, you can change it to search your opponent's deck for a card and attach it to himself. It plays in 2 past iterations of Lapis who were based around stealing cards from your opponent, and instead of banishing a resonator to refresh a God's Art skill, require him to banish 2 cards attached to himself. Then he can keep stealing, but it comes at a -1. Instead, Lapis's J-Ruler side doesn't do anything with Limit Break outside of just having one himself. His God's Art is a generic board neg, and it doesn't seem to play into any of the things that his cards have been shown to do. But then again, there really isn't much cohesion between his archetype outside of a few weak cards, but all of these stronger ones, the ones you're going to actually use, have very little in common with each other. Despite his awkward design, thanks to the overbearing power of his resonators, Lapis can hold his own against a decent amount of decks that aren't based around infinite value combos, mostly by abusing said combos himself. Of all the minions, I find Blazer and Sylvia to be the only ones worth main decking. Allosaurus is great in the side deck, but given his limited interaction with counters and there not being a specific type of counter Lapis can generate himself, he's not really worth wasting space for. Lenneth is absolutely abysmal in terms of a boss monster. At least I assume that's the role she was intended to play. She's a Marvel rare, she's a 3 cost, she has 1k for stats, and she comes with a limit break, but it's not that good. It gives her one of 3 effects, of which one is just a worse version of Regalia break, another that is a very specific board wipe that only hits strangers, and the last one which has to be one of the most depressing toolbox pools ever because the team couldn't bother to reprint a 12 Apostle worth using, or find it in their brain space to revamp 1 or 2 of the Apostles. I'm just saying, if I have to pick between Lenneth or Sylvia as the 1k I'm going to slap into the field on Judgment, I think I'll pick the one that can do 25% of starting life on the turn she enters the field. She, like many of the named minions, has a chant associated with her that lets you search your deck for a card and add it to hand when her limit break is active. But given how much built-in draw power Lapis has naturally on top of the overabundance of specific search abilities Darkness has, if you really need this card to get your game-ending play, then I think there is a problem with your deck. Also, all the unnamed minions share the gimmick of giving some minor benefit when you pull them through Lapis's Look at Top 3 Add 1 to Hand ability, and most of them just aren't worth it. In a format where deck space is limited and many decks want to run specific cards at 4 copies because they absolutely have to, it's hard to justify running any amount of copies of a Rabid Rabbit or whatever the hell this thing is. Okay, on to a deck list. While I'm sure a decent amount of people hate the thought of using any variant of a Sigurd engine, Gill gets a fair more amount of value out of him than just looping yourself up to 9 stones. But, you know, that's always a solid idea too. Alter works really well with Blazer in particular, since it will trigger his limit break effect to burn for damage when banished by another effect, and also give you a potential replacement while doing so. You can either immediately sack Alter and grab another Blazer, or sack something else and now you have a Sylvia. And while Alter is still the best generic value addition to grab, netting a Schrodinger with Sigurd will also let you blink World Ender, or whatever other Darkness Regalia you want to trigger more limit breaks or draws without having to waste resources on playing another Regalia. Realistically, you won't be calling more than 1 or 2 limit breaks, but if you find yourself in a pickle and need Gill's limit break, well, I guess this kinda helps you do it quickly. Dark Alice does her normal job of protecting the grave while giving another way for Blazer to trigger his ability. The one of Lucifer is mostly there to help finish a game, since you can dig him out of your grave at the opponent's end step before going all in on the next turn. Between him, Sylvia, and a Blazer banish, that's at least 3,200 damage, and that first 800 isn't too hard to do. I thought about making a Lapis J-Ruler build, but since his special stone is the only way for him to produce Moonwill for his own judgment, I found it's not exactly worth it to play over anything else. I'm not sure why the designers saw it fit to avoid letting World Ender produce Will for Lapis's judgment. Did they think it would have been too strong? Were they just autopiloting because no other regalia does that? And if so, why not let World Ender have a second will production effect specifically for Moon, a la Change the Heart? A 2020 J-Ruler is pretty goddamn funny, but 2k is a pretty low amount to swing for considering the investment and time you might need to ensure that damage even happens in the first place. I'm not really sure how to go out on this one. It's weird thinking Lapis is probably one of the weaker rulers of the set when his archetype consists of a 2-cost 10-10 Swiftness Flyer and a 12-12 1-drop with a burn attached to it, but his interaction with the game is very passive and kind of boring, at least in my opinion. If he ends up being strong later, I doubt it will have anything to do with his generic ruler and J-Ruler abilities, and more to do with his number creeping resonator line.